All right, what is going on, Laker fans? Appreciate you guys tuning in on this great Wednesday evening. Kind of had this one planned here for a couple of days. I didn't promote it because was working on getting the guest and a very special guest. So I'm very very happy to have on Mark Medina, NBA writer. I could sit here and list out everything that he does. A contributor to CBS here in LA, Spectrum Sportsnet, Fox Sports Radio as well. Mark, thank you very much, buddy. I know we cross paths a lot at all these Laker games and everything else NBA related, but thank you for coming on and being a guest here on Hoops Talk.
Yeah, thanks for having me. As you know, there's always a lot of stuff going on in the NBA, a lot of stuff going on in the Lakers, so a lot of fun stuff for us to talk about here.
Now there is, and you know it's interesting because I think your role is one of the more unique roles, and for those, and I'm sure there's a lot of people here on my channel. If you follow the NBA, you've probably either ran into stories that Mark Medina has been a part of, whether that's with the NBA, specifically with the Lakers. But Mark, if you don't mind, I would love for you to just give a little bit of background. You've been around the NBA for a number of years. For my audience, those that are getting a chance, and this is the first time, obviously, I've had you on Hoops Talk, my channel specifically. Can you give a little bit of a background of what you've done around the league and specifically what you do day to day today?
Yeah, sure. I don't want to, read off like the LinkedIn profile or go all Wikipedia entry, so I'll try to make it quick. As far as the NBA, started out as a Lakers blogger, LA Times, in the middle of that 29-10 season when the Lakers beat the Boston Celtics in the NBA Finals. Did that through the Phil Jackson's last season, then the lockout shortened season. Then I jumped to the LA Daily News to be the Lakers beat writer from 2012 to 17. And that was a pretty eventful time. The first year started off with the very eventful season of the Steve Nash, Dwight Howard experiment.
Oh, yeah.
Mike Brown getting fired, Mike D'Antoni getting hired, Kobe Bryant tearing his Achilles at the end, and then covered the rest of Kobe's career. And then the first season after Kobe's career ended with the Lakers. Then I got a role to be the Warriors beat writer up in the Bay Area for Bay Area News Group. So I was there for the second championship with Kevin Durant, as well as when they lost the Raptors in the 2019 NBA Finals. Then came back here to LA to be a national NBA writer with USA Today. And so I did that for 2 years through a very unprecedented time with the pandemic. 2021, jumped to NBA.com, still based in LA as a national writer. Unfortunately, is what has become a trend, particularly as of late in the last year and a half or so. I was a layoff casualty last year, but thankfully, I've been still doing a lot of different NBA work on the freelance end with different writing stints, and to what you alluded to, doing still a lot of TV and radio work with Spectrum and CBS LA and Fox Sports Radio. So, yeah, a lot of twists and turns as far as career path, but the common denominator is I've been in California, and it's always been NBA focused, so it all ties together.
Well, I have an incredible amount of respect for your work, and I've been watching you and the work that you've done for a long time. So glad to talk Lakers basketball with you, and I appreciate you kind of giving a little bit of insight there of what the role is on a day-to-day basis. I don't know of anybody that is either around the team or that has at least a pulse of what's going on when it comes to Lakers basketball as good as you. And here's a Lakers team that they're 45 games in. They're 22-23 on the season. I know we're going to spend a lot of time on just how the team is doing specifically. I definitely want to get your thoughts on the NBA trade deadline coming up and D'Angelo Russell and everything else. But before I do so, what do you think of this team? 22-23, 45 games in. One night they might look good. Another night they might look terrible. How much of a surprise are you that the Lakers are sitting where they are? And just your overall thoughts on what you've watched all season.
Well, I think the description that you summarized about the Lakers really captures them. Some nights they're great, some nights they're terrible. And what is usually the definition of that kind of team? An average team that's barely above or below 500. So it's the old adage that I think Bill Parcells said back in the day of you are what your record says you are.
Absolutely.
And so I think that the thing that can be invigorating for the Lakers is that LeBron James and Anthony Davis, they've been mostly healthy. They're playing at a high level, and they have continuity from most of last year's roster that got to the Western Conference Finals. So there is a pathway for them to get better. But there's also a pathway that it could just stay the same because we have a whole half season's worth of games to show us that. And even when you account for some of the overlapping injuries and being role players being what they are, which are usually by definition inconsistent because they're role players. There is a disconcerting feeling that the Lakers are just going to become a sub 500 team that is good, not bad, but is always going to have to scratch their way and claw for every single win. And while maybe they could be a tough out in the first round, would ultimately become nothing more than a speed bump for the top seed to eliminate in the first round. So it's a very weird Jekyll and Hyde identity that the Lakers have at the roughly halfway point through the season.
Do you, Mark? It's funny because I'm going to use just the last couple of days as an example. And these are people I know that you interact with as well. Michael Thompson, I do the pregame show with. Brad Turner, obviously, he's been covering the Lakers for a long time for the LA Times. My partner that I do the morning show with, Travis Rogers. There are a lot of people there that still think, look, all this team has to do is get in the playoffs. And if they get in the playoffs, they're dangerous. All of a sudden, the way the NBA is set up and you're not playing back-to-backs and you're in a city for a couple of days, there's some advantages, as we saw last year come playoff time, to a player like LeBron James or a team like the Los Angeles Lakers. They certainly got the experience. They got to the Western Conference Finals last year. I don't need to walk through the resume of LeBron and AD having won a championship and specifically the history that LeBron has. Do you feel the same way that even watching them, I'm more discouraged from a team watching 45 games. Sometimes I feel like they think they're better than they actually are. They think they could kind of just flick that light on whenever they want. I think it's very, very dangerous territory for them to think that. Where do you stand? Do you believe that this team as is, and we'll just forget about the February 8th trade deadline for a quick second, do you think they can still be a really dangerous team as long as they're just in the playoffs?
Yeah, it's a good question. I have conflicted feelings, but they're not necessarily contradictory feelings. I think that when you add all the variables together, they've underachieved the first half of the season. Here's why. They are 9th place in the Western Conference right now, despite the fact that LeBron James and Anthony Davis have mostly been available this season, despite the fact that they have both consistently played at a high level. And you would think, based off of their time together ever since joining forces in 2019, that the formula is, as long as those two players are staying healthy and playing consistent, they would be a top force in the NBA. And they're not. They're a team that can barely make the play-in tournament right now. That being said, what the solution is moving forward, I wrote a column about this for Sportsnot earlier today about going into the trade deadline. There's no question that the Lakers have a lot of needs. The problem is they don't have a lot of assets to address those needs. And so I think from a practical and pragmatic lens, I think when you weigh everything, the Lakers' pathway towards success more likely will stem from them leaning on their continuity and trying to get the best out of not only their star players, but their role players and Darvin Ham's adjustments as far as his improvement in that category and cleaner bill of health than not only making a dramatic trade that could diminish the roster depth, but also leave themselves vulnerable toward having to try to expedite team chemistry without a full training camp, without a lot of practice time. And look, last season, the Lakers became a dramatically different team before the trade deadline, obviously for the better. So, if you have talent, if you have players that fulfill positional needs, maybe it doesn't matter if you don't have enough practice time in training camp. But the dynamic is different than last season because last season we saw through the halfway point of the season that Russell Westbrook just wasn't a good fit. Some of it his fault, some of it personnel fault from the organization. But it was clear that they need to trade him, and they were able to flip him as well as in other deals to really improve that roster depth. Here, the dynamics flipped on its own because they decided last summer to, for the most part, lean in on retaining most of that supporting cast. And so with that, I don't have a lot of optimism that they can flip that same supporting cast for either a player that will dramatically change their fortunes or a player that could overcome the fact that all of a sudden they don't have a supporting cast to reduce the pressure on LeBron, James, Anthony Davis, as well as protect themselves from possible injuries.
Mark, I'm going to stay with that pressure for a quick second. I'll throw this one to the front office. How much pressure do you think right now is on that front office, is on Rob Pelinka? Listen, we've been saying this basically every year since Bron has got here, and it's insane to see LeBron still able to do what he's doing. And listen, is he the same player as he was 5 years ago? Of course he's not. Is he the same defender? Of course he's not. Are there times where you can see his age? Sure. But he's still 39 years old, and he's producing as one of the best players on this team with Anthony Davis, and that's a pretty consistent thing, at least we're seeing from LeBron. How much pressure do you think is on Rob Pelinka to say, I got to figure this out by the trade deadline, because every single day that goes by, you're not guaranteed anything with LeBron James. He's still throwing uppercuts to Father Time. It's impressive what he's doing, but he's also doing something that we've never really seen in this league before. At 39, he's still productive. You just don't – tomorrow's not promised. Let's put it that way. How much pressure do you think Pelinka is feeling to figure out what to do by February 8th, whether it's going out and making a big move, a small move, just your perspective on what you think is going on through Pelinka's mind?
Yeah, I would suspect that the Lakers have a lot of pressure not to make a move, but to make the correct move or reject the wrong move. And I think that there's a clear
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, because it's not about the Lakers have to make a trade or else. It's they need to be aggressive in making phone calls and seeing what's available in the landscape. But if the landscape is just, sheet metal and scraps, there's no point in collecting those, or there's no value in that. And so the Lakers, inevitably being the Lakers, there's always going to be pressure to try to win a championship, especially in the context that they have an opportunity to eclipse the Boston Celtics for the NBA record for most titles, especially given the fact that the Celtics are considered one of the championship this season. There's also pressure because, as you mentioned, LeBron James is still on the team. And even though he's 39, even though it's his 21st season, I wouldn't say that he's playing the same at the same level of play that he showed in his prime, but he's still played at a very productive level, so much that he should be an all-star in the all-star game next month. And so with that, the idea that the championship window is closed would be too dramatic, but it's closing shut a little bit. And so you always want to do what you can to still climb through that window. But to the point that I made earlier, while the pathway might be slimmer than some of the other teams in the Western Conference, like the defending champs, the Denver Nuggets, or some of these young teams like Oklahoma City, Minnesota, you look at the East, Boston, Milwaukee, Philadelphia, there's still a pathway for them to succeed, partly because of LeBron, but partly because of AD, and partly because they could have a healthier and more consistently productive supporting cast in the second half of the season.
Mark, I don't know what your opinion was on D'Angelo Russell, so I think this is going to be a two-part question. Whether you were one that thought to yourself, no, D'Lo's a good fit on this team, or you thought, hey, if you can shop D'Angelo Russell and there's hopefully another path out there with some draft compensation and whatever else to improve in that position, whichever path that you were on, what do you make of his last 6 games? What do you make of the fact that all of a sudden now he's putting up 25 points plus a game, shooting incredibly efficiently? And a lot of this has to do since he was put back into the starting lineup. what do you make of this stretch? And if you can share how you feel about D'Angelo Russell before this happened, and if that's changed your opinion at all on D'Lo.
No, I think it's really just crystallized the fascination of what makes him valuable, but what also makes him vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
Dating back to last season, obviously things, as we've talked about, start with LeBron and AD, but D'Angelo Russell really represented the key change with the roster moves that they made before the trade deadline, where he was the key that, really made the offensive engine run.
Hmm.
And so when you look at his times where he's making shots or missing shots or not being the best defensive player that you'd want in your backcourt, it shouldn't cloud the bigger picture that he is very valuable, not just because of his great playmaking and vision ability and his potential to hit key shots at key moments. It's really the fact that he knows how to make the offense hum and get the best out of LeBron James and AD, make life easier for them, but most importantly, make life easier for the entire team by ensuring that the offense runs smoothly. And so, as it pertains to this season, I think the Lakers are mindful of this, and they should be mindful of this, that he's not a quote unquote untouchable player. He could be traded because of his weaknesses, the fact that he is on an expiring contract, and the fact that the Lakers are trying to find ways to improve the roster. But, whether the Lakers should trade him or not is very circumstantial. What are you getting back in return? And I think the thing that's humbling for the Lakers is the other team going to be interested in him? I think the best example that we can talk about here is the Atlanta Hawks. I mean, no doubt Dejounte Murray would be a great player. He has a lot of defensive potential. He can be a great scorer. But if I'm the Atlanta Hawks, it wouldn't make sense for me to get D'Angelo Russell on your team when you have Trae Young in your backcourt, who's a ball-dominant playmaking point guard. Other potential deals, it could make sense for other teams, but I can't think of that specific hypothetical here. So when you're looking at this recent sample size about D'Angelo playing really well, it should be comforting to the Lakers for two reasons. One, it's showing that, maybe the solution is to start him, even with Austin Reaves, which was something that Darvin Ham didn't think earlier in the season, because both players are really effective when they have the ball in their hands. The second thing is, if they're going to trade him, his value is high right now because he's playing really well. So I think when you look at all that, D'Lo's second stint with the Lakers since the trade deadline last year, the good outweighs the bad, but he's not in the category of LeBron James, Anthony Davis as one of their star players, and we're not going to even entertain any sort of trade talk discussions with any teams.
I know, Mark, it's just a complete guess here, but you mentioned Dejounte Murray, and I love the example that you're giving and I think we all get caught up in this, and I'm sure Laker fans get caught up in this as well. Hey, Dejounte Murray, that sounds great. Let's make the deal. Well, you're making a deal with the other side as well, and the other side would like to also make sure it makes sense for them. I saw in some reports, I think it was Shams Charania put it out, that if the Atlanta Hawks were to make a deal, they're looking for a third team that they could ship D'Angelo Russell to. Like you said, they need a team that actually wants D'Angelo Russell, or there's some advantages of why they would want him on his team or want that specific person on their team. I'm gonna kind of go back to this. If the Lakers were able to find a way to add Dejounte Murray, and let's say everything that we're talking about, and the Hawks found a third team and they got what they needed, what do you think of that fit? If it is Dejounte Murray on the Lakers, and I think we all know some of his strengths that he have, the fact that he has an extension that's going to kick in for 4 years. He's 27 years old right now. I know it's me just kind of guessing here, but if Dejounte Murray found his way on the Lakers and it worked for everybody, how do you think that fit would be on this specific roster?
I think it would be a great fit, because when you're looking at Dejounte Murray and what he represents, I mean, I think that he can be a good defender. He can also be a good scorer. But as far as the Lakers are concerned, his defense can relieve pressure off of Austin Reaves. I mean, we've seen Austin Reaves. He's a competitor. He's not afraid of getting physical. But even though he's shown that the fact that, oh, he's quote unquote scrawny is overstated, he's a gamer, he's competitive, he can withstand it. It's not necessarily still a strength of his. And that can relieve the pressure off of his defensive responsibilities, as well as allow Austin, even though he is that scrappy guy, to focus on what he's really good at as a playmaker and an additional scorer. The other thing is Dejounte Murray can also score as well. So I think it's a great fit, but as you all know, with the trade deadline, it always has to require the other team to think what they're getting in return is a good fit here. So I would be surprised that Atlanta would agree to that deal. If they were to say, well, what about Austin Reaves or Rui Hachimura? I don't think the Lakers would think it would be worth the cost because of the fact that they've invested so much in those players and they think that they're just going to continue to improve as players. And so that's where, I have a lot of respect, and I don't want to say empathy because, these are first world problems here, but being an executive is really challenging because you have to figure out a lot of minutia and a lot of quick time reactions here with salary cap, roster fits, etc. So it's a very difficult challenge that the Lakers front office, as well as the other teams, 29 other teams, are going to have leading into the February 8th trade deadline.
Mark, any other names that either we've heard just from rumors, stories, or maybe in your own world, in your own circles, any other names that you think are associated with the Lakers that you feel like would be realistic, or there is a path to try to get one of those players? Doesn't have to be a big name, but anybody out there in the market that you feel like could potentially be available?
I can't think of any. And the reason it's funny you bring this up because I was trying to brainstorm a list of realistic guys a few weeks ago before going on Spectrum Sportsnet. And I was trying to do research with certain folks around the league about how realistic is this guy, that guy. And every player on the list, even though it wasn't the, quote unquote superstar player, is like, yeah, it's not realistic. So I think really the realistic pathway is buyout market and maybe a marginal move where you're getting a rotation player. And maybe that involves trading their lone first round pick. But outside of packaging someone with D'Angelo and maybe Jalen Hood-Schifino, while everyone outside of LeBron and AD I wouldn't consider untouchable, there are a lot of lessons learned dating back to the Russell Westbrook trade that the Lakers are very cognizant of the value of having roster depth as well as some semblance of continuity. And look, as you know, the Lakers historically like to get star players, but I think given the landscape of where we're at with, a more stringent salary cap, not as far as the worry about what their profit margins are, but just more of the second Abram and the salary cap restrictions with coming to grips to being able to construct a roster. That's making the Lakers, I think, a little bit more pragmatic than maybe the so-called glory years in the past, where it was just about chasing stars and not worrying about everything else.
Mark, you brought up two players, and just to get your thoughts on, we spent some time talking about D'Angelo already. You brought up Reaves, you brought up Rui. What have you thought? And I know they're two completely different players, but they were two of the players that were re-signed in the offseason. What have you thought of each one of those players so far this year? Disappointments, things that you've liked? I know their paths are not equal. Rui's been in and out of the lineup, but what have you thought of both of their seasons so far?
Yeah, well, they both have unique circumstances, and it's certainly, if I'm looking at from results, it hasn't lived up to what I thought that they would show the first half of the season. I think when we were looking at Austin Reaves, we're seeing his growth from last season, him gain a pretty good contract, him playing at Team USA. Historically, players that played with the U.S. national team, whether it was in FIBA or the Olympics, they would carry that over into the following season because they're already in pretty peak shape. But I think in fairness to Austin, given where he's at in his career, where he's still a young player, I think, the fatigue and the wear and tear got the best of him. And you might think, well, that's weird. He's young, but there is a learning curve and learning how to navigate that. And then I think it was also the adjustment of now getting even more scrutiny on the scouting report. So I'm going to give Austin Reaves the benefit of the doubt that I'm not under any illusion that he was going to be an all-star this season, as Darvin Ham was mentioning during Summer League. But I think it is realistic that he's going to have a better second half of the season of being the version of Austin Reaves that we saw last season in the second half of the season. With Rui Hachimura, same thing. I think with him, a lot of it was injury related, obviously with him being out of the lineup, but then the nature of what those injuries are, of with it being a concussion, there's so many protocols you have to jump through before being able to be cleared for anything. And then once he came back, coming off the nasal fracture, having to wear a mask, there's a lot of discomfort there. He's trying to find his rhythm. I think, with Darvin, the fact that the lineups were fluid, whether it was injury related or not, that was a challenge for Rui as well. So I think for both players, there is a realistic pathway that they're going to more closely mirror what they showed the second half of last season following, All-Star weekend.
Yeah, it's been the Rui thing in and out of the lineup. Lakers, I would say, paid him for what he did in the playoffs, not necessarily for what he did in his entire career. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't have a lot of optimism towards him. I think that's why they gave him that paycheck. They believe in him. They believe that he can be a player that contributes on a night in, night out basis. And I think the portion that you mentioned about Austin Reaves, maybe not enough is made of that, that he really didn't have much of an offseason, but it is interesting because teams are going right after him. Teams are making him work on the defensive side, which clearly, of course, I think that always has an effect on what you do offensively. Just your legs aren't going to be the same. There is a scouting report on you now. It's been fascinating to watch both of those players, and I personally, I like what you said in the beginning. I had higher expectations for both of them in the first half of the season, and hopefully in these final 40-plus games that they obviously turn it around. Got a quick question for you on Darvin Ham. For somebody that's been in the league as long as you have, or at least around the league as long as you have interacted with so many different coaches, what have you made of, I guess, what are my interaction with Laker fans, they get very frustrated with Darvin Ham, and I don't think it's always fair. I think some of their criticisms are fair. What do you make of how Darvin Ham, how he's done so far this season, second year as the Lakers head coach? And anytime you're the head coach of the Lakers, there's always, this roller coaster of emotions from game to game, and he's even talked about it. What are some of the areas that you've liked with Coach and some of the areas that you still think he's got a lot of work on?
Yeah, well, look, I think that one of the misnomers about Laker fans is that, there's a tendency to characterize them with a broad brush that, they're just the bandwagon Hollywood crowd, and then they're the overly reactive to everything crowd, where in my experience, they're passionate, but they're also informed. And so the criticisms that they've had for Darvin Ham, as far as his rotations, his starting lineups, his adjustments, I think they're all valid. But I think what you have to do with those criticisms is put them in perspective and what it ultimately means. When I'm looking at teams and assessing kind of the blame pie, so to speak, usually no one's ever blameless. And in this case, Darvin's not blameless either, but I put more of the blame pie for the Lakers underachieving first half of the season, more on the injuries and more on the fact that we thought that we were going to get more out of the supporting cast that we've seen. And I don't want to say we, the Lakers have seen. So I think that's the bigger thing. And it's not to say that there wasn't enough effort. Everyone had good intentions, but there was an expectation by leaning in on the continuity card that with another training camp and more familiarity, they would be able to build off of that. Now, the injury things only are valid to a degree, in the sense that Gabe Vincent was one of their key free agent acquisitions. He's a really serviceable player. And when you're dealing with overlapping injuries, where you're always having to have different lineups and then integrate a new player there, that can create challenges. But it also doesn't fly, because one of the reasons why the Lakers decided to lean in on continuity was for the theory that if there's an injury for any of the role players, there's strength in numbers. So I don't want to say it doesn't matter, but they can camouflage and cover it up and still get by. And that hasn't been the case. So with that, I put the blame more on the circumstances of the injuries and the supporting cast not making the best of it. But then I put the blame on Darvin not figuring it out in a much smoother fashion. But again, all three parties here have an opportunity to change course, whether or not the Lakers front office make a roster move or two before the trade deadline.
Final one for you, Mark. And I think it's actually perfect. Like the different topics, I think, keeps us to kind of reflect a little bit on what the first half was. I think talking about some of the individual players, why the Lakers are sitting here today. It's a prediction, but how do you think things play out the rest of the regular season? You think the Lakers figure out a way to get this thing back on track? They have not been good on the road. They're about to get in the midst, after tomorrow's game against the Bulls, a 6-game road trip. The schedule is not going to get really all that much easier, but you think the Lakers are able to get this thing back on track, or do you think they're going to hover around 500 for most of the rest of the season?
Yeah, I think that they're going to improve. Now, I do want to clarify my blame pie answer here, because you brought up a good thing about the schedule. The fourth reason why they struggled was just the weird nature of the schedule with the in-season tournament and just the condensed nature of being on the road a lot and having a lot of games. But I would put that in fourth place behind the other three factors that I outlined. But to answer your question about, do I think that they'll improve significantly in the second half of the season? I do. I expect that the Lakers, I don't know who they're going to get, but I think that they'll make a move before the trade deadline. But I don't think it's going to be significant. I think it's going to be, a role player or two for another role player or two. So it's on the margins. But I think regardless of that, you're going to see the supporting cast do a better job. You're going to see Darvin do a better job. And I think the comforting thing is you're going to see, for the most part, LeBron James and Anthony Davis still stay healthy, because even though there's questions about LeBron being at 39, he has shown that he can at least delay father time a little bit. AD has his injury history, but the reality is he hasn't had a major injury since that right foot injury last season. And I think with his offseason regimen and the way the Lakers are managing him, he's not going to be injury free, but he's not going to sit out a huge string of games. So with that, I think that they're not going to get through the playoffs by the play-in tournament. They're going to get through the playoffs the traditional route of at least being a 6 seed. But I don't think they're going to get to the NBA Finals, let alone win a championship, or even the West Finals. I think their ceiling is the second round, but there's a reason why they play the games. And even though I talked about some of the the Western Conference favorites like Denver, Minnesota, Oklahoma City, there is a pathway for the Lakers to get past some of the other Western Conference teams, because even though the Lakers will have their own injury questions inevitably with LeBron and AD, so do a lot of other teams, the Clippers, the Phoenix Suns, the Dallas Mavericks. And you never wish injuries on anyone, but it's just a reality of professional sports. So with that, they can have a much more productive second half of the season, but in the grand scheme of things, I think it'll lead to a second round playoff appearance and nothing more.
All right, you could follow Mark Medina on Twitter at @MarkG_Medina. Mark, I greatly appreciate you coming on Hoops Talk. It's always fun talking hoops with you. I know sometimes we just end up somewhere in the media room talking Lakers basketball. So the fact that we could do it here is fantastic, and I'd love to do it again sooner than later. But I appreciate you taking the time and coming on.
I appreciate you having me, and I'm sure whenever next time is, there'll be plenty more to talk about with the Lakers. That's just how it rolls every season.
That's how it'll always be. Well, thank you, brother. Appreciate you coming on. Everybody tuning in, thank you for doing it. Please subscribe to the channel. Thank you very much for tuning in. That's Mark Medina. I'm Alan Sliwa. Thanks, Laker fans.